Two pilots died during a routine flight at one of America's busiest airports. A plane T-boned a fire truck on the runway. And when investigators pulled the whole thing apart, there was no villain, there was no reckless decisions made, no one there was thinking, hey, I'm just going to ignore safety today. It was just a system doing exactly what systems do when nobody's watching the gaps. That's what we're looking at today on Crew Fusion TV, but what we're looking at is we're looking at it through a HOP lens. Now, if you're not familiar with what HOP is, Human and Organisational Performance, it's a safety program, it's a safety philosophy that has changed the way people look at safety over the last 15 to 20 years. Right. Now, here's the short version. HOP is built on 5 principles. Now, this incident illustrates all 5 of them really well in real time and with devastating clarity. Here they are. Error is normal. Blame fixes nothing. Systems drive behaviour. Learning and improving is vital. And a leader's response to failure matters. Keep those in mind because you're about to watch every single one of them play out. I'm David, and welcome to Crew Fusion TV. Now, it's just before midnight on the 22nd of March 2026. Air Canada Express Flight 8646, a CRJ 900 operated by Jazz Aviation out of Montreal, is on its final approach into New York's LaGuardia Airport. It's about to land on runway 4, and like I said, it was a routine flight with a very experienced crew. The 2 pilots, Mackenzie Gunther and Antoine Forrest, they've flown this leg dozens of times themselves. At the same time, there's a Port Authority fire truck is responding to a separate emergency that's occurring on the airfield. And moments before the CRJ 900 is about to land, the controller clears it to cross runway 4. The plane is a quarter mile out. It's about 130 feet above the ground. There's still time if the fire truck reacts as it should, fairly swiftly. The aircraft is coming towards them. It's traveling at 106 knots, which is about 122 miles an hour. 25 seconds before the impact is when the truck asked to cross. 5 seconds later, it was cleared to cross. 9 seconds before the impact, the controller yells, "Stop, stop, stop." 4 seconds before the impact, Truck 1, stop, stop, stop. The turret operator on the truck hears it. He hears the stop, 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 but doesn't know if it's for them. By the time he hears his truck number, they're already on the runway. He sees the aircraft lights coming, and then bang. Both pilots on the CRJ 900 were killed. Dozens were injured. It all happened within 9 seconds. It's an absolutely incredible testament that no one in the fire truck was killed in this. So they literally got T-boned by an airliner, and it was extremely lucky that none of the passengers were killed. When you look at the pictures of the results of the aircraft, there's a lot of luck and there's a lot of faith involved in how a lot of people survived this crash. But let's talk about the HOP principles, okay? So here's the first HOP principle, right? Number 1, error is normal. Now, when you look at it from a technical point of view, the controller made a decision error. The truck crew, they had a communication error. Does this mean they were incompetent? No, it doesn't. Does it mean they were having a bad night? Maybe, but that is not the point here. In any complex, high-tempo environment, humans make errors. We always have, and we always will. That is not a character flaw, it's just biology. It's cognitive science at play. It's what happens when people are managing multiple competing demands with imperfect information. It's completely normal. Now, Mackenzie Gunther and Antoine Forrest, they didn't do anything wrong. They were on a normal, stabilised approach, doing exactly what they were trained to do. The system just put them in an impossible situation, in an impossible position. And here's the thing about those complex systems. This happened just before the middle of the night. Complex systems, they don't take a rest in the middle of the night. While 90% of the workforce goes home to bed and the traffic slows down, the building goes quiet, but the holes that are in the barriers, they stay exactly where they are. They don't just close because it's midnight. They don't disappear because the shift is smaller. The Swiss cheese holes don't rearrange themselves because you're tired. That night, the holes lined up at 11:37 p.m. and it wasn't because someone chose to let them line up. Now let's look at hot principle number 2. Blame fixes nothing. And this is exactly why blame fixes nothing. In the moments after this crash, the controller's voice was captured on the recording. After the collision sheared the nose off the aircraft, he said, "I messed up." That moment is heartbreaking. And it's also one of the most important sentences in this whole story. Not because he did mess up, but because of what that framing does. Now, when a person absorbs a system failure as personal guilt, that's where the learning normally stops. We give the system a clean bill of health, we fire the individual, or we retrain them, or we move them sideways, and every other gap in every other barrier stays exactly where it was. So blaming people doesn't make the next flight safer. It just makes the next person that's working in that broken system feel worse about what's coming. Now let's talk about hot principle number 3. Systems drive behavior, or we can frame it as context drives behavior. And now here's what the system looked like that night. Now, gap 1 was there were no transponders on the fire trucks. LaGuardia Airport has what's called a surface detection system, ASDE-X. It's specifically designed to catch runway incursions. Now tonight it did nothing. Why is that? Because none of the ground vehicles were fitted with the transponders that required it to actually work in the first place. The system could not track them. So the controller in the air traffic control tower had no visual representation to show what vehicles were actually doing. The controller and the system was blind to the things most likely to cause the problem. And here's the kicker. The FAA had urged airports to fix this the previous May. It was a known gap. It was very well documented. There were recommendations in place to fit transponders to all vehicles. However, it wasn't a mandatory fix. It was recommended. Therefore, it was not acted on appropriately. Let's talk about gap 2. Stop, stop, stop. In a high workload environment, who's that for? The truck operator didn't know. That's not his fault. That's a communication system design problem. What's gap 3? The controller workload. Now, the tower was simultaneously handling an aircraft that had 2 rejected takeoffs. There was a separate ground emergency near a terminal, and there was that inbound flight on short finals. One controller ended up transmitting on both the ground and the tower frequencies at the same time, who's managing more than the role was designed for, and he was possibly in violation of the facility's very own staffing procedures. What was gap 4? The runway lights. Now, there's lights that show when vehicles are allowed to cross. They were illuminated, then they extinguished 3 seconds before the impact, right as the truck reached the runway edge. Whether anyone actually saw them is still unknown, but these 4 barriers, they all degraded all at once. Not because of one bad person, but because of a system that had been quietly accumulating risk for years and years. So now let's talk about hot principle number 4, and it's called learning and improving is vital. The way we learn from accidents, incidents is vital. Now, here's where the story gets a little bit of hope in it, which is really cool. After the crash, the NTSB chair, Jennifer Homendy, stood up publicly and said, air traffic controllers should have all the information and all of the tools to do their job. This is 2026. That was a good quote. Now, that's not blaming people. That's a system-level diagnosis stated really plainly. And the FAA responded to that. They announced a $16.5 million investment to install transponders on nearly 1,900 vehicles across 44 airports. If that was a fix the NTSB had been recommending for years. Like I said, it wasn't mandatory. They said they'd been planning it for months. But of course, now that people had died, they accelerated that effort after the crash. It's pretty common how that happens. In today's day and age, it's a shame that it takes people to die to make these things mandatory. If it was mandatory in the first place, it would have saved lives. Now, that's the learning loop. It's working. That's good. It's working slowly and at a cost that no one should have to pay because people died, but it continues to work. The question that Hop asks is this: why does it take that fatal accident to accelerate what was already known to be necessary? And that's the really important question in this case study. Okay, so that's Hop principle number 4, learning and improving is vital. Let's have a look at Hop principle number 5. This is a really good one. A leader's response to failure matters. Now, think about what happened in those 24 hours. The controller said, I messed up. That was a quote. A raw, human, first-person acknowledgement. It's not a denial. It's not deflection. That matters, even if the framing is incomplete here. NTSB Chair Homendy drove down from Washington, D.C. to New York through the night after this crash because her investigators were stuck in TSA lines due to a partial government shutdown that was occurring at the same time. So she didn't wait. She just drove to New York and showed up, which is actually pretty awesome. She then stood in front of cameras and named the system failures directly, very clearly and without any hedging. No scapegoating, just here's what we know, here's what failed, here's what needs to change. Now that's what leader response to failure looks like. That's cool. It's not about having all the answers on day one. It's about being present, it's about being honest and directing attention toward the system, not toward the nearest available human to carry the blame. Now contrast that with what could have happened. A press release, a quiet disciplinary process, an unnamed controller shouldering a system failure all alone. The response matters because it sets the tone for everything that comes after, for whether people report the next near miss or quietly decide it's safer to say nothing. So while we're talking about the NTSB chair, let's have a chat about her. Jennifer Homendy is the 15th chair of the NTSB. She's the 4th woman to hold that role since the agency was created in 1967. She's been at the NTSB since 2018, originally nominated by President Trump and unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Then she was nominated again by Joe Biden during his presidential term as chair in 2021, also unanimously confirmed. So this bipartisan credibility is genuinely pretty unusual in the current US political climate. So this person, Jennifer Homendy, she must be a bit of a superstar, which is really good to see. Now her career has been built around safety across all transport modes. She's a vocal champion of the safe system approach. It's a philosophy that zero fatalities is the only acceptable goal, and that systems, not individuals, are where safety is built and where it breaks down, right? Now that's as close to Hopper-aligned thinking as you'll find at the head of a major regulatory agency, which is really cool to see. Now before the NTSB, she spent 14 years as a staff director for the House Committee on Railroads, Pipelines and Hazardous Materials. Now, she's someone who's been inside the machinery of how safety recommendations get made, how they get ignored, pushed aside, and occasionally acted on. She knows exactly how long the transponder gap had been sitting in an unfixed recommendations list. Now, let's have a quick chat about her direct response to this LaGuardia crash. She publicly cautioned against pointing fingers at air traffic controllers, calling out the heavy workload environment that they operate in every day, and said that many, many layers of protection would have had to fail for this collision to happen. Now, that is almost verbatim Swiss cheese language from a regulator on day 2 of an investigation. Once again, solid thumbs up. She said controllers should have all of the information and all of the tools that they need to do their job. This is 2026. And added that controllers are using an old system that needs to be upgraded and that safety needs to improve all around, not just one person, but the whole system. She drove from Washington, D.C. to New York overnight after midnight. This plane crash occurred just before midnight, so she gets in a car and drives to New York because her investigators are stuck in TSA lines and had to personally beg TSA to get one specialist through after a 3-hour wait. Now, that detail is worth noting. The investigation into a fatal crash was delayed because the TSA system had failed, it was broken, and it had gotten in the way. Now, Homendy is a genuinely strong, real-world example of hot principle number 5. She showed up, she named the system, she protected the frontline workers from blame in public, and pushed immediately towards learning and action and improving. She's not perfect, and the final report is actually still 12 to 24 months away, but her immediate response is textbook. I do note all of this information comes from the preliminary report. Okay, so the final report is still 1 to 2 years away. So when you want to discuss hot principle number 5, a leader's response to failure matters, NTSB Chair Jennifer Homendy, she got it right and she nailed it almost instantly, which is outstanding. It's what we want to see. Now, the pilots, Mackenzie Gonther and Antoine Forrest, they died doing a routine job in a system that had too many quiet gaps, and there were not enough honest conversations about those gaps. Now, that's not unique to aviation, is it, right? If you work in any high-risk environment, whether it might be defence, rail, construction, health, it doesn't matter where you work. There's gaps in your system that probably aren't as visible as no transponders on the fire trucks. Sometimes those gaps, they're subtle. They're in the workarounds that your team accepts every day, in the combined roles that are fine until they're not. In these safety systems that technically exist, but nobody's ever tested under real conditions. Now, the hot principles gives us a way to find these gaps before the holes line up. If we always are waiting for an accident to happen to fast track recommendations that have been sitting in an accident report as a recommendation for years and years and years, to actually go out and do something about them, that's a problem. And we've already figured that out, right? But if you have a learning team's sort of setup where members of your team, the dogs are having a great time, look at them go. If you have a learning team set up within your organization where you can grab a bunch of people that are critical to that role and ask them what they need to make their daily jobs better or to make the system work better. And from that learning team, then you bring out whether they're like recommended or mandatory recommendations. That's when you have a win. Imagine if like the leadership chain listened to the SMEs sitting around a table in a room and said, why can't we have transponders on every vehicle here, like today, right now? And they obviously blew that off. Someone blew that off because it wasn't considered important enough. But if you can have just a learning team on any given day where nothing bad has happened and actually have real action come from that learning team, oh my God, that's the way to change the world, to change your system. You don't have to wait for people to die to install systems that are actually effective and that work every single time, despite the small human errors that are inevitably going to be made. Now, I've given you the 5 hot principles. Now let's talk about James Reason's Swiss cheese model, because these barriers in the Swiss cheese model, they all lined up on this fateful night, didn't they? Now, quick background, James Reason developed the Swiss cheese model in 1990. The idea is that in complex systems, organizations build multiple layers of defense against accidents. There might be procedures, there's technology, there's training, there's regulations. Now, each separate layer is represented as a slice of Swiss cheese, right? Now, each one of those slices has holes in it, and those holes are weaknesses or gaps in that potential barrier, right? Now, those holes, they move around. No piece of Swiss cheese is the same. Most of the time, they don't line up, but when they do, when a hazard finds a clear path through every one of those layers simultaneously, of course, that's when an accident occurs. Now, the model distinguishes between 2 types of failures, like active failures. Now, they're the unsafe acts directly linked to the accident. They're the things that people didn't do or did do in the moment. There's latent failures. Now, they're the contributing factors, and they may lay dormant for days, weeks, months, years before they contribute to an accident sequence. These latent failures, they live very high up in the system. They live in management decisions. They live in the way you resource your system. They live in the system culture. They live in the way you design the system. And they're latent, and they're just sitting there waiting to be tested. Now, Reason organized these into 4 levels, okay? Let's talk about them. So unsafe acts at the sharp end, preconditions for unsafe acts, supervisory factors, and organizational influences. Active failures sit at the front line, latent failures sit in the levels above, and that's exactly where most of the actual risk lives. And here's the critical insight. Whole alignment is rarely random, it's often systematic. It's driven by cost pressure or culture decay that quietly thins those defenses over time. The holes don't wander into alignment by accident, they're nudged there. So let's talk about LaGuardia Flight 8646 and how the Swiss cheese breakdown affected these people on the night. So let's talk about layer 1, the organizational influences, right? They're the deepest latent failures. Now, these are the decisions made very far from the runway, very far from the airport, often years earlier, that quietly degraded the system. There was the transponder policy gap. There was no federal requirement for ground vehicles at the airports to carry transponders. It was a known gap, as we talked about. The NTSB had recommended the action for years. The FAA had urged, but not mandated, that airports act in May 25. They were not acted upon at LaGuardia. It was a deliberate resource and regulatory decision. It was not an oversight. It was a clear decision that had been made not to install those transponders. The air traffic control staffing shortfall. The FAA was approximately 3,500 controllers below target staffing levels nationally. That's a lot of people. That's a budget and workforce planning failure at the organizational level. It manifests on midnight on a busy runway where there's one person managing multiple roles. That's all it takes. And let's talk about the last organizational influence, the aged infrastructure. Jennifer Homendy named it directly. Controllers were operating in an old system that needs to be upgraded. That's an organizational investment decision. The tool designed to prevent this type of accident had degraded by years of deferred modernization. It's a shame. Let's talk about layer 2 of the Swiss cheese, all right? So the supervisory factors, these are the ones that are really close to the sharp end. Position consolidation before midnight. Now the facilities there was a rule that was made in 2023 that stated that positions were not to be consolidated before midnight. The collision happened just before midnight, 11:37 p.m. Now, whether this was a supervisor decision or whether it was a staffing normalized deviance of exception, or whether it was accepted drift, it sits right at the supervisory level. One person made a decision, someone authorized it, and someone tolerated that decision. Now, the second one, there was no verification that ASDE-X was vehicle equipped, the transponders on the vehicles. Supervisors at LaGuardia are responsible for ensuring their safety systems are operationally fit. If ground vehicles weren't transponder equipped and ASDE-X was known to be blind to them, that's a gap that should have been visible in local safety management. It wasn't acted on. Now let's talk about the third Swiss cheese layer. Latent conditions meeting the sharp end, preconditions for unsafe acts. Now these are the environmental and human factors that set the frontline worker up for failure. We're talking about a high workload, a late shift, and multiple simultaneous events, right? That's enough. The controller was managing an aircraft that had 2 rejected takeoffs, and there was another ground emergency near the terminal. And then you've got the CRJ 900 on short final, all happening at the same time. He was the only person just before midnight. There's a fatigue factor in here as well. Now that's a precondition. It's not an excuse. It's a condition that the system created. Let's talk about the radios. It was an ambiguous radio environment. He had to operate on multiple frequencies, ground and tower. There were multiple aircraft, multiple vehicles. When you yell out, stop, 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 without a call sign, now that's information that may or may not land with the person that needs to act on it. The communication environment was a precondition for the truck crew's failure to immediately self-identify as the target of the warning. And the runway entrance lighting that extinguished at the wrong moment, the lights were functioning perfectly, but then they went dark 3 seconds before the impact, just as the truck reached the runway edge, right? Now, is that a technical anomaly or is it a design limitation? It's still under investigation. That's a really important part of it. Either way, that last visual barrier to the truck crew was removed at the worst possible second, which is extremely sad. Now, while we look at these layers of the Swiss cheese, let's look at number 4, unsafe acts. Now, once again, active failures at the sharp end. These are the actions or the inactions that were the immediate precursor to the collision. The controller cleared the truck to cross with an aircraft on very short final. There's a lot of people that would say, oh, well, I wouldn't do that, so it's the controller's fault. That's a big call. At the time of the clearance, the CRJ 900 was about a quarter of a mile out at 130 feet. The decision to clear the crossing was the active failure closest to the accident. But it was made inside a system that provided no real-time vehicle tracking. There was high workload, there was combined roles, there was an aged radar system, there was pressure because of the multiple other emergencies that were happening on the night. He was trying to be a boss and manage them all, and he was doing an absolutely fantastic job. He really was. You listen to this controller, he was doing a fantastic job at managing multiple situations. He really was. The truck crew entered the runway without confirming the call sign. When stop, stop, stop was broadcast, the turret operator didn't know if it was directed at them. By the time the call sign was added, the truck was already on runway 4. It was set up for a T-bone in a well-designed communication system. All safety critical calls, including the call sign up front, should be said. That didn't happen. That's a training and procedure design failure that's above this layer, but the act of entering the runway sits right there. Okay. So every single one of these active layers was enabled, amplified, or directly caused by failures in the 3 layers above. Remove the transponder gap. If ASDE-X was working correctly, it alerted the controller. You can fix the staffing. The controller wouldn't be juggling multiple roles at midnight. You can mandate the call sign first radio protocol. The truck crew hears truck 1, stop, 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 before they hear anything else. The sharp end didn't cause this accident. The sharp end is just where this accident becomes visible. Now here's the key takeaway for this video in this accident. Every single one of the active failures at layer 4 was enabled, amplified, or directly caused by failures in the 3 layers above it. If you remove the transponder gap where, ASDE-X would have alerted the controller. If you fix the staffing, the controller wouldn't have been juggling multiple roles at midnight. If you mandate the call sign first radio protocol, the truck may have heard truck 1, stop, 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 and he may have stopped. While it seems like the sharp end caused this accident, it really didn't. The sharp end is just where this accident becomes visible. So that's why it's really important that the holes, that the weaknesses in your Swiss cheese layers of defense are either really, really small or that they don't line up at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night. Here's another important takeaway that has everything to do with what happened at LaGuardia, but also a whole lot to do with every other system-based incident that you have within your very own workplaces, whether it's just a near miss or a minor incident or a major incident. If you whack that hop lens over the top, where error is normal, blame fixes nothing, systems drive behavior, learning and improving is vital, and that really important one, a leader's response to failure matters. If you put that lens over almost every accident, sure, you're going to have some people making mistakes, but it will really urge you to take a good look at your system so you can make it stronger, less brittle, and a lot cheaper to operate because you won't have to deal with the major emergencies that happen. We live in a society, unfortunately, where the mainstream media loves to throw out a whole lot of blame and a whole lot of punishment. We need to push back on that natural human tendency to try to find someone to blame, to try to find the last person that touched it, to try to blame them so that we don't have to worry looking at the big picture, looking at the big system out of laziness. That's the first problem. If we can look at it as blame fixes nothing and error is normal, that is the first step to making a better system within your workplace, looking after your workers and actually caring about what happens to them. So ladies and gentlemen, while I sit here in my comfortable backyard with my dogs running around, the Crew Fusion Hop Academy is where I talk about these things with you, with the community. I've got a community of people on board who talk about these things routinely, most days. And what it's about is people helping other people ensure that the holes in our Swiss cheese are as small as possible or nowhere near lining up, because we're talking about all of these different things that are happening. People are bringing in real world problems and we're talking about them at a pretty high level so we can help each other out. That's what the Crew Fusion Hop Academy is all about. There's a link in the bio. It's a cool place to hang out as well, besides the fact that you get to learn quite a bit and look after yourself and other people's safety systems. And besides the free community, there's a bunch of training in there as well. So if you're brand new to the high risk world of doing business today, you can do grassroots training trained by people who have done it before, who are really experienced, who can help you out and make that training really worthwhile, really beneficial for you. So yep, I look forward to seeing you in the Crew Fusion Hop Academy. It's available on School. Like I said, the link's in the bio. Feel free to subscribe, like, comment. all of the things that good YouTubers should do to support each other. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's been emotional.